Ladies and gentlemen, I think this session, from catch-up to creation, growing through open innovation, is an exciting session, my favorite. And I'm going to introduce to you two of my favorite people at UC Berkeley. They are thought leaders. They have written many books. They have published a lot. And I have learned a lot. I have grew in my own in leadership through both of these gentlemen that are sitting at this podium, and the world will be transformed because of some of the ingredients and the ideas that they're going to share with you. Very transformational. And the Smart Village idea, my idea came through mainly because of all this ideas that are generated at the center. Richard Lyons, I would like him to come and give us some introductory remarks and also about his new role at UC Berkeley. He was a two-term dean at the Haas School of Business. He is the architect of the words. When I first came to this campus from University of Southern California, I heard these words, leading through innovation. And that's what he's all about, leading through innovation. And he was the former chief learning officer at Goldman Sachs, and also a dean, and he's also a beautiful musician, and has many talents. I just love him, and he's a people person. And he's going to come and give a few remarks, and then next will be Henry Chesbrough, who will come up right after him. And he's the father of open innovation. He's the one who coined the term, what open innovation, and he's going to talk a lot about that when he's here, and most of his talk, and you'll understand what it is. And Smart Villages is very much connected to it. It's about Uberizing knowledge, Uberizing people in remote parts of the world who are great resources and assets, great DNA. They don't need bachelor's degrees, high school education. They just need access and connected to the ecosystem. They can be contributing members to make this a greater world. With that introduction, I'll ask Richard Lyons to come and speak to us.
Solomon very graciously credited us with many books on innovation. The books on innovation really are Henry's. He is, a dyed-in-the-wool subject matter expert, just a pioneer in the area, and I think everybody in this room knows that. I'm actually newer to the topic, so I've served as dean, as Solomon said, for some 11 years of the business school. And at the end of the day, when we start asking what is the root source of human creativity, human advance, societal advance, it's hard to talk about that question without talking about innovation. And so what do we at universities, what role can we play in terms of human capital formation? I'll talk just a little bit about that. I want to make sure to get Henry's comments, and then we can have a discussion, and I will help organize that discussion. Let me start by saying this. I have a brand new role on campus. My brand new role on campus my title is Chief Innovation and Entrepreneurship Officer. So how about that for a title? Thank you. Thank you. It's an exciting title. It's exciting because the job didn't exist before, and we're defining what the heck it means, which is especially exciting for me. But I'll talk about some of the ideas so it's just for the whole Berkeley campus, right? So the lab that Jennifer Doudna's lab that came up with gene editing and what does that look? CRISPR-Cas9 and the science going on at any of your IITs or any of your universities or Berkeley. I mean, it's mind-bending. We know that. Very rarely do we get close enough to it to really start to appreciate it. And I will never be a deep scientist in these fields, but I am getting introduced to a lot of this stuff, and the magic level just goes up and up and up. So I'm very, very, very excited about that. But let me say a few things more concretely that might be helpful to you. As we think about, how do we organize Berkeley to be stronger? Part of it, what statement do you start with? What problem are we trying to solve? Or if you prefer more positive language, what opportunity are we trying to address here? And this is an important question in the sense that let me start this way. If the chancellor of this wonderful university, Carol Christ, you saw Carol just this morning, right? If she came out and said, we're going to make Berkeley the entrepreneurship university, there are a lot of people that would applaud, certainly in this building. But there are a lot of people that would resist that phrase. They would resist that phrase, I think, for quite rational reasons, some of them. One reason would be, show me the academic literature on entrepreneurship. Show me the deep knowledge that's getting created in that field. Not to say that there's no research going on in that field, but compared to many of the other fields that are represented here, a lot of people would say, you're picking a field that isn't anywhere near as thick as many, many other fields on campus. And that is a perfectly legitimate initial reaction. And then a second reaction might be this: of all these great public universities in the U.S., great universities, this is the singular's going too far. But in so many ways, Berkeley's incomparable because it is a public university. And when we make a public university all the more commercial, and that's a word I feel comfortable with, commercial, but there's certain faculty and staff on this university that it's like, if we're making this public university a lot more commercial, I start to get uncomfortable. And you just have to recognize that that's always out there. So as a matter of change management, if we want Berkeley to be even stronger at the things that we're talking about, we have to find a nomenclature that speaks into the listening of everybody. And that's important. So imagine I am talking, for example, to an undergraduate classics major or an undergraduate English major, humanities, liberal arts. And I said, wow, we've got all these new classes, some of them learning by doing, some of them more classroom oriented. One of them is called the art of agency. Do you want your life to have purchase on the world? There isn't a young person at this university that wouldn't say yes to that. And I think you wouldn't find a person who chose to come to Berkeley who isn't fully subscribed in that way of living one's life. It's what Berkeley's always been about. Suppose I said we have another class called Becoming a Change Maker. And though you might not, some of you in the room will know this name, Mario Savio, right? Image of 1960s movement leader standing on a police car, orator. What if the first reading on the syllabus of a course called Becoming a Change Maker is an article like Mario Savio as an entrepreneur? How do we think about speaking into the listening of people who might not hear this? This isn't just a question about Berkeley as a university. If we want to capture the energy in our societies, whether in India or here, we do have to speak into the listening of people, but concepts like agency and purchase and what do you want your life to look like, those are some of the things that we're working on here. And I think when we start to frame it that way, the liberal arts, the humanists, all of us, we can hear different things in those phrases, but we can all agree we are solving the same problem. If we said, let's take any of your IITs or any of your great universities, or if we took Berkeley and we said, let's start with this. The intellectual creativity of Berkeley is vast. It is. When we think about the transformation from that intellectual creativity to societal benefit, at what efficiency is that transformation happening? And whatever we call the initial condition, if we say we're currently at 50%, if we could move that to 55%, what an enormous contribution we would have made together. Now you might listen to that and say, well, that's an unobjectionable problem statement, let's do it. But when you actually think about it that way, two things happen that you might not realize. One, I don't think there's anybody, faculty, staff, or anybody else on this campus that would object to that as being sort of what the work that Berkeley should be doing, benefiting society. But of course, the students we educate is part of that transformation as they go out into the world and influence it. And the research and the degree to which the research reaches society and changes society. Here's another small example. When you state the problem statement that way, you start to realize how many people on this campus or any other campus in India or elsewhere, how many people have any idea which of the faculty wrote the highest impact textbooks? At least here at Berkeley, we do not code textbooks as research. It is not even evaluated in our performance evaluation. But it's an important way that we actually change the world. Why not call out those 10 most successful textbooks? Why not celebrate those people among the many other things that we do? How good are we at that transformation? And could we move it from 50 to 55%? When we start to unpack what that transformation looks like, we can make all of these great universities even more potent in terms of societal impact. And that's part of what feels like my and others' job descriptions can look like. How do we move those needles? And so I'll stop there with my comments because we all want to hear from Henry. But when you start thinking about what is your role and how do we partner together, whether it's India and the US or Berkeley and any of your institutions, these are the kinds of questions that can expand us. They can expand us together. But finding the right language is critical. Again, Chancellor Christ comes out and says, we're going to be the entrepreneurship university. Just speaking honestly, dead on arrival. Wouldn't work. But can we find language that increases our joint capacity? Oh, we can, and we are, and we will. Henry Chesbrough. Over to you, Henry.
Well, I want to start by thanking my Berkeley colleagues. It's been great working with you. I want to thank the organizers for bringing us all together here in the beautiful tree house that we have up here. And I do want to say to all of you to take a good look at the bay because you cannot get this view at Stanford. In the time that I have, I want to talk on two subjects. I want to talk a very little bit about open innovation, and then I want to talk about growth. And in particular, growth in surprising places, like rural villages in, say, India. And so with that, I'll get started. Thinking about innovation processes, we sometimes represent them as flow diagrams of ideas and technologies originating from some laboratory or moment of inception, and then going through a set of processes, both of development and evaluation, and eventually getting filtered and selected to go out into a marketplace. And sometimes these things are represented as funnels. And the funnels are wide at the beginning because many possibilities are considered, but then there's a lot of evaluation and selection, which is why the funnel's narrow, and we start many more things than we finish. So that's kind of a representation of how organizations innovate. There are other ways you can represent it, but it's a useful one, particularly for what I want to show you, which is the idea of open innovation, because what we do in open innovation is we drill holes in the funnel. So this is the holy funnel, H-O-L-E-Y. And the idea here is that, yes, ideas and technology still go through a process of inception and development and evaluation and feedback and so on, but they do so in a more open environment where the boundary of the organization is more of a semi-permeable membrane rather than a very rigid boundary that keeps everything out or contains everything in. And with this much more permeable membrane, ideas and projects can flow through to the market in many different ways. So that's what is the general intuition behind this idea of open innovation. Not all the smart people work for us. We do, as Paul Sappho said, we do have an abundance of useful knowledge and information. We may not be able to access it. We may not be able to incorporate it and absorb it ourselves, but there's a lot of stuff out there. So if you start with that as your organizational idea for how you construct your innovation activities, you work differently than you might have done 50 years ago. When I first came up with this concept in a book that was published in April of 2003, I did a Google search using open innovation as the search term on the Google search engine, and I got back a couple of hundred page links. And I actually just went through them to see what had happened, and in almost all the cases, the word open and the word innovation had showed up in the same sentence when an organization opened an innovation office in Chennai. That was one of the page links. But there was really nothing to the term itself as a concept. For a later book I was writing, I did the same search term on the same search engine, and I got back almost 500 million page links, which I did not read all of, and found that indeed there really was something that had become, this really had become a concept. Now, we don't all mean the same thing when we say open innovation, and that's like Eskimos talking about snow. In the interest of our time today, I'm not going to take the time to parse that, but nonetheless, something important has happened during that time frame. Maybe another way to look at it was when I went on LinkedIn last week, and I did a search on jobs with open innovation as the search term. I got back 97,000 jobs on LinkedIn. And I suspect if I had done that search in 2003, well, I couldn't have, LinkedIn wasn't around then, but if I had, I bet I would have found very, very few. This has also moved into the world of policy. In the EU, the just stepped down Commissioner for Research, Science and Innovation, Carlos Moedas, coined his policy of the three opens: open science, open innovation, and open to the world. So that was really gratifying to see, and he actually had the Horizons 2020 funding program. 14 billion euros were programmed along these lines, so that was pretty fun. We're also seeing it in sustainability, and we were just talking about sustainable growth in the previous session, really the previous two sessions. And open innovation has a role to play here, too. I'm sharing with you a recently published case study from Haas with the Center for Responsible Business and the brewer Carlsberg, not in Norway, but nearby in Denmark. And they were trying to reduce their environmental footprint and found that 40% of their footprint was in their packaging. And so that was a motivation to try to do something to make it more sustainable, but they did not want to get into the packaging business. So they wanted to catalyze something to be much more sustainable, but they didn't want to do it themselves. A great recipe for open innovation. So what they did was they found some technology from a Canadian startup. They got funding from a Danish technical university. They found another company to take the technology and really start this initiative. They gave them the specifications for what this packaging would have to do to be commercially usable for them, and that has given rise to a wood fiber bottle. So instead of glass, it's actually going to be made of wood fiber. And it was announced at the World Economic Forum. It's supposed to come out really any month now, and it's an example of what can be done in sustainability. As Rich said, we get paid by the word in academia, and so I'm no exception to that. I'm going to actually talk now about something we have excerpts of out in the hallway, which is the next book called Open Innovation Results. And in Chapter 7, I actually explore this question, which I'm going to excerpt for you now in the remaining time I have, of can we do something with this concept in a rural setting where there isn't a lot of money? And so this, if you think about the problem in a rural setting, we talked last session about the urbanization. And Ganesh, you were sharing just how many more cities there were going to be of 1 million or more people. I think you said 60 or 70 million cities. Even after all that, there's still going to be hundreds of millions of people in India in villages. And those people in these villages often confront a very difficult, brutal, interconnected cycle of poverty, where it's almost daunting to think about where can you intervene, because all these things interconnect, and one thing feeds into the next. And so through the work of others, this is not a new observation. Lots of people for a long time have really tried to make positive interventions here, and many of them have frankly come up short. Unfortunately, government aid works while the aid is flowing, but as soon as the aid stops, the money is no longer there, and unfortunately there's not often enough left over for things to sustain and scale on their own. And so with this idea that Solomon Darwin really pioneered, could we take this open innovation concept and the whole leaf funnel you've already seen and apply it in a very different context? And take a rural village, a poor rural village, and make it a smart village. And Solomon's definition of a smart village is a community empowered by digital technologies. So the digitalization we talked about in the last session is relevant here. and open innovation platforms, you'll see more about that in just a moment, to really create access to global markets, empower people in these local villages, give them access to markets they previously didn't have, give them access to technologies and know-how they might not have had access to, raise their incomes, and really try to impact this vicious cycle of poverty. That's the experiment. So more specifically, the point of intervention to get at that cycle was connectivity or digitization. If we can get them digitally connected, we think that might be the entry point to start undoing all that negative cycle. And really importantly, and this is where the open innovation part comes in, we're not driving this with government philanthropy, government aid. We're not driving it with private philanthropy. We're not even driving it through corporate charitable donations. We're actually driving it through companies looking to grow in new markets. There was 2 sessions ago, we talked about the bottom of the pyramid from C.K. Prahalad. It's a similar idea. If we can find things that poor villagers want and are willing to pay for, companies will find that quite valuable. And this is a real village, real people buying real stuff with real money. So it's a very high fidelity test. And then if these villagers want and are willing to pay for it, we have to figure out a way to supply it. And then the other hope here is that the needs of these villagers are going to be pretty similar to the needs of other villagers in other rural communities. So we're not doing highly customized village by village delivery. We're hoping that the needs of poor rural villagers in one village are pretty similar to those of others. And then we can scale through the market. Because these are things that companies can learn how to supply profitably. They know what to do. And this is where market capitalism can really work some of its magic. So what's different about this? Rich taught me about useful differentiation, and we have some here. One is that most of this money is supposed to come not from governments, but from companies. And not from the charitable arms of these companies, but the business units of these companies looking to grow. That's the first thing. The second thing is we're asking the villagers, we talked about agency just a moment ago, the villagers have agency here. They are spending their own money in whatever way they wish. We're not telling them what they can and cannot do. In fact, we want to learn what they're going to do so that we can then program accordingly as companies the offerings we want to make. The third thing, as I mentioned, is the companies get real high fidelity, high quality feedback. And then the scaling. So these are the things that are part of this experiment. As some of you already know, in the state of Andhra Pradesh, the village of Mori, which I don't think I'm giving away any secrets, is a place that Solomon knows very well, was chosen as the pilot for this. And we're now, I think, operating these activities in nearly 500 villages. It's actually now spreading to other states as well as the original state of Andhra Pradesh. So what was the first signal? If you recall the hypothesis, could we get companies to actually make small investments to see what villagers would be really willing to do? Could we even get them to play? And the answer to that was, at least at a pilot scale, you bet. 40 companies in total were willing to do it. Interestingly, half of them were from India, half of them from outside of India. So this wasn't just foreign multinationals going in to extract yet more as colonialists in these villages. There was a lot of local indigenous investment as well. There were some other learnings too. We did get lucky on one thing. Google decided to make a fairly big investment in bringing fiber optic connectivity to the village. And that was a fairly sizable investment given the size of the population and the purchasing power of the population. But aside from Google, all the other investments were pretty small. And so we had 39 of them to do it. And one of the things that was fascinating is when one company is willing to make a small investment, it actually makes it a little easier for the next company to also make a small investment. And so this becomes a positive, virtuous cycle rather than the negative cycle we talked about earlier. The second thought was, well, where does the funding really come from? we told you that in theory, most of it should come from the companies, and at least at the pilot, that's exactly how it turned out. So the government was there, it was an important player, but it was a supporting player. It was not driving the funding for this initiative. Then the third signal is, can it make a difference? Can it actually increase the incomes for villagers? And here again, at the pilot scale, the answer was good news. Now, in different industries, the reasons for the impacts were different. So in the case of textiles, being able to have larger national and even international markets for some of the saris was a great way for incomes, again, mostly for women, to go up. And that was a big contribution. Cashew processing was another one. Here I'm showing you shrimp farming. And one of the issues that affects incomes in shrimp farming is the quality of the water. And we had some discussion in the very last session about water quality. And it turns out that with sensors, you can monitor the salinity of the water, and you can do things that when the salinity starts to go in a bad direction, you can start to flush the system to save the shrimp crop before it's lost. And things like this allow you to get a better yield, which allows you to get higher margins. Now that's from the farmer perspective. Now let's look at it from the company perspective and look at both and particularly from IBM. This is something that I'm seeing more and more in the digital transformation of our world. They're calling precision farming. And the idea is IBM looks at its technology with those sensors to give a lot of new information to farmers that they didn't have before. And that's something that for at least some farmers, they value it and they're willing to pay for it because it does allow them to increase their yields, makes it easier for them to get to market at the right time. They've got a better idea what the prices ought to be. There's less money taken by the middlemen in between and so forth. What IBM gets out of it is all the data. So in addition to learning what the farmers want and are willing to pay for, they now get the data on how these activities are actually working from these sensors. And again, if this is similar to how it would work in other villages, having that data is very useful for them as they try to scale this in other settings. And the third lesson I would say is not one that was intended, but governments turn out to be agents of scaling as well. We were thinking that companies would do the scaling because that's how they can, once they know how to do it profitably, they will naturally want to do it. But we're also seeing that sometimes governments, when they hear about what's going on in one state, I think I might like that in my state too. So they are becoming scaling agents that I don't think we anticipated really at the outset. Now, in the academic classic fashion, yes, we need more research. This experiment's only been on the ground for 3 years. We don't yet know how much this sustains over time. We don't yet know if village incomes remain higher or if they get bid down. As more and more villagers get online, do they compete each other down? We don't know. That's one of the things we have to research. But it's an exciting experiment and one that I'm particularly proud of to be indirectly helping. And I think we can all give Solomon Darwin a round of applause for a brilliant initiative. So this is actually, we've got this, chapters 1 and 2 of this new book are out in the hallway out here. And the book itself will be out at the end of November. We even have a QR code that you can click your phone on and it'll give you a pre-order. If you want to read, not only, this is chapter 7, there are 8 other chapters you can see as well. I didn't have time to tell you all about those. But with that, I think we have a little bit of time for Q&A, and thank you for your attention.